Okay, friends. Coming to you early morning again, and this time you're getting a tour of the rest of my family's hobbies. This is my mom's sewing room because it is too cold to go to the shop, and it is too early to be making a lot of noise, so I'm hoping to get textile acoustic dampening in here. Because our internet was out all over the neighborhood all day yesterday. So here we go. The early Middle Ages, this is where we left off. And yes, we're going to focus a bit on Britain. And I do want to comment that this is my jam. And yeah, we could have spent the entire semester talking about this stuff, but then we wouldn't have been able to contextualize it. So I sacrificed the stuff that is totally up my alley in order to give us a fuller picture. So I hope that you're just as excited about this stuff as I am, and you want to pursue it further instead of alone. So we left off Britain right here. The Roman legions are withdrawing, the Picts are invading, and you're in this position where you have a figurehead king with no military. What's he to do? Hire mercenaries, obviously. So this is where we get the Angles and the Saxons. So Hengist and Horsa are mercenary Germanic leaders, and they lead a kind of pan-Germanic mercenary force. And they come on in and essentially set up a racket because they figure out pretty quick that Vortigern is not able to do anything for himself. And that's why he's hiring them, and that the way to keep the Picts and the Gaels out of the Romano-Brits areas is to rely on foreign mercenaries. And as he does this, the Angles and the Saxons are like, it'd be a shame if the Picts got your little town here. I'm not sure that I can afford to defend it if I don't get a little bit more land and gold. And that is how the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes and some Frisians got established in Britain. They mobbed their way in, right? And as they did so, the size of the Saxon community in Britain grew and grew until they outnumbered the Romano-Brits, and then they just kind of took over. So originally, right, look at that 500, 600, 700, 800, that red area. It's vaguely called English because this is a linguistic map, but it'll tell you a bit about how much of this area was settled by the Saxons coming in from the east, but also the Scots coming in from Ireland in the west, right? You see that up in what is now Scotland. You see that growing green patch, and that's Scots Gaelic, which means that they definitely came from Ireland, settled Scotland, and then they intermarried with the Picts. So the Picts don't really disappear, they just kind of merge with the Scots, which makes sense because they have a lot in common culturally. And then we also want to highlight that we have these remaining Celtic areas up here, the Cumbric and the Welsh over here and the Cornish over here. Remember, we talked about how when Rome was here, Cornwall was just too far away. Wales had this mountain range, and then this just tends to be the farthest reach of this region. So we see that same kind of boundary set up again that allows the Celtic peoples to stay in a region even while the other parts of this island are being conquered by a different people. So this is where we get the idea of Old English. I'm going to use Old English instead of Anglo-Saxon because there's no such thing as an Anglo-Saxon. They had an alphabet that is based on the Nordic runes. Those are Germanic, and they are primarily an alphabet for carving into rocks and hard materials. That's why they're so angular. So they have their own alphabet, and then they settle in. They establish 7 kingdoms. These 7 kingdoms. You'll notice you just have this like outlasting Celtic region in here in the mountains, and in here in Wales, and over here in Cornwall, and then up here in Scotland. But the Anglo and the Saxon groups, they finally settle and they take over and they form 6 independent kingdoms of each other. It's not 6, 7, Hept, 7. More coffee. And different groups of them settled in different areas. So we can see where the Saxons are. They're in Wessex, West Saxons. They're in Sussex, the South Saxons. And they're in Essex, the East Saxons. We can see where the Angles settled, East Anglia. Mercia is a very interesting, weird conglomerate, and their dialect of Old English is actually so different that you almost need a completely different language course, which you need for Old English itself. Since we're not reading any Old English poetry, let me go ahead and Nu schulen herien heaven reaches with Methodist meachta and his moederthonk werk olderfader so he undre was eche drichten or estelde. So that is the first half of the oldest written English language poem. You could understand it, right? You can't. It's essentially a form of German, an old High German, essentially. And if you have German, you might have actually caught some. And if you don't know German, you probably didn't catch any of that. And that is because of what happens to English later. We'll get there. But Mercian is such a distinct dialect that even knowing how to read all the variations of Saxon, Angle, and even Jute versions of the language doesn't prepare you for Mercian. It's a whole other thing. It's a whole other territory. And I want to point out, when we had Rome come on in, you brought Christianity, and then Christianity made it to Ireland. That's St. Patrick. And then when Rome withdrew, so did Christianity. So the Saxons brought with them their pagan religion and culture. And re-Christianization actually came from missionaries that came from Ireland back over to Britain. So that was a part of this moment. And Northumbria, this region up here, ends up becoming a major center of medieval European learning until, of course, oh, wait. See, example. We've already looked at the Lindisfarne Gospels, I know, but they were produced up there, and they're so pretty. So it's a major center of learning until the Great Heathen Invasion with, I think, the guy who's got the best name ever, Ivar the Boneless, at the head of the army. I don't know what that means. I don't know why he was boneless. But the key thing about this is that the Vikings start invading, and at first they're just raiding, and so they hit the monastery of Lindisfarne, which is like right here in the ocean. It's on an island. They hit that shit up first. And then after a while raiding this region, they're like, hey, the climate is nicer here in the winter. Why don't we just stay? And that's when you have the Great Heathen Invasion coming along to just try and settle this region. And this is where we get Ælfred the Great. He's called the Great because he unifies Britain, or not Britain, the Angles and the Saxon into a single kingdom under his leadership, which is the first time that that's happened. And he does this because the Vikings are winning. They're picking off one king at a time, and eventually he makes a peace with the Vikings, and it's called the Danelaw. And he's like, okay guys, if you stay on that side, you can stay here, and we'll stay on this side, and everybody is fine. Right? That's the peace that he negotiates. And it doesn't sound like a great victory, except that it does stop the killing. And the second thing that it does is it establishes enough peace that Ælfred can say, look, y'all, we've basically lost all of our learning and literacy that we had a couple of centuries ago because of all these invasions and wars. So let's revive learning, and because nobody speaks Latin anymore, let's translate all the most important books. Actually, what he says, everything most needful for men to know. Translate that into English. And that is why we have a great body of English literature from this period, because Ælfred insists on translation from Latin because nobody can read the Latin. So, cultural milestone, that's a thing. Yeah, I'm not going to get into Ælfred's lineage, but I will point out that Ethel is the Old English word for nobleman or like prince, and all of his elder brothers got named Ethel because they're higher in line to the succession. And then there's Ælfred, and they're like, oh, he'll never make it to king. Anyhow, the other thing I will point out is that Saxons have some, there's the Ælfred jewel. Saxons have a Germanic style of society in which women have a lot more rights than becomes normal for the later Middle Ages. In particular, they have the right to own property, they have the right to get a divorce, and kings are elected rather than inherited, even though by the time we get to Ælfred, there's kind of a little bit of both going on. And so women in positions of power also have the right to vote for that king alongside other men in positions of power. And we actually see this with Ælfred's daughter Æthelflæd, which is a super cool story that I'm not going to tell because we have to keep moving. But let me just say that she is a badass. She's a military leader. And at first she's the puppet, or her husband is like the puppet leader of Mercia. She's Ælfred's daughter. And when her husband dies, Ælfred's like, oh, I guess I got to appoint somebody. And Mercia's like, please don't. Just let Æthelflæd handle it. So that's early Britain. That's what's going on over there as the Saxons come in. So the key thing to take away there is there's no such thing as an Anglo-Saxon. There are Angles and there are Saxons. But the idea that they formed some kind of like unified cultural or racial unit, that is a much later invention. And it is created specifically in the 19th century to justify the British Empire as a kind of like racial superiority. So again, another thing we could spend a lot of time talking about. I'm teaching an entire PhD seminar on this next semester. So if you want to learn more about it, hit me up. Continental Europe, there's something kind of similar going on, right? Here's Saxony, and here's those Frisians, some of whom are over here. They just don't kind of occupy that space as a ethnic group large enough to stand out. And then we have... let's look at what else is going on, right? So this is 650 AD. So this is well after the fall of Rome. The Goths are really established here in Italy, but we'll call this Lombardy now. So this is the like Italo-Gothic kingdom. And then this is the Etruscan area, a little slice carved out that's ethnically different. And then we have, this is what's left of the Roman Empire, not very Roman. This seems to be a tributary state of that. The Avar kingdom in the Balkans and the Slavs over here in Eastern Europe. There, if you'll recall, they're also a linguistic group that occupied this same region. And you remember those Goths got pushed out of this region and down this way. So the Visigoths established themselves in here, and we have our remaining Celtic regions up here. So not only these portions of Britain, but Brittany. They have Bretons there as well. That's a fun backstory that we could spend a lot of time talking about. But the thing I really wanted to draw your attention to is, you remember the Franks, they were a Germanic people, and they push in this way, in here, into the Frankish kingdoms, and they establish a kind of loose unity, like the Heptarchy, right? So they're different kings, but they have general understanding. And same thing with the Frankish kingdoms, right? So they have a cultural and ethnic commonality with being Frankish, but then they adopt Latin, which is where we get the language of French. They adopt a vernacular form of Latin that gets spoken in this region. So it's not quite there yet, but that's where we get the French language from and how they stop speaking Germanic. And then as we move forward a little bit to the Holy Roman Empire, we see that Frankish kingdom unified. And this is what gets called the Holy Roman Empire. This is the year 800. So England, Angleland, has been kind of established as a unified thing. Not totally, because this is pre-Viking invasion. Right? Vikings come from up here. The Danes, the Jutes, the Norse. And what we've got going on down here is the Frankish kingdom gets united under Charlemagne, and Charlemagne is crowned emperor of like a revived Roman Empire by the Pope in 800. And the reason that this is attached to the idea of Rome is specifically to invoke it as a kind of messianic return to the power of Christendom. And that is going to matter when we get to Crusades. So what's happening under the Holy Roman Empire is a revival of different art forms. So we do see a little bit of neoclassicism, although it doesn't get called that, in these Roman style arches. But you have your own special style going on as well. So it gets mixed with that kind of Celtic and this Celtic imagery that's native to that region with the knotwork, and then the Germanic imagery that comes with the metalwork. And you have this like really interesting fusion culture under Charlemagne. And this period is called Carolingian. And that actually is a part of the High Middle Ages. But there's more to the High Middle Ages than that. So we're going to turn next to what happens to feudal Britain. Okay, this is its own lecture, but I like the slides. So we're going to go through them and just not hit all the same points. I usually, when I teach this as a full lecture on its own, we LARP it in person, obviously. We live action role play it, and it's super fun. So I had to find a way to make it just as interesting without role playing. So here's what ends up happening in Saxon. Pay attention to the color codes. You don't really need to know the names of folks. There are Normans. They're these guys. These are the people, the Saxons, who are living in England. And there are Danes. And then there are people who are a little bit of both, right? And in particular, Edward. So North Sea, this is where our color codes go, right? So there's the Saxons are living here. The Danes are living there. And the Normans are living here. And then we'd still have our token Celtic regions. And I want to make a point about Normandy, this region right here. It's called Normandy because this was also an area that was invaded by Northmen. While the Great Heathen Invasion was going on in Britain, they settled in this area that is now France. Hrolfr, who gets Latinized to Rollo, he settles this region and he makes a kind of pact with the King of France and gets to be a Duke of Normandy, and they adopt the French language and some of the French culture. So this is what the color codes mean. This is where they belong. I'm going to go through these slides, which are cute and fun and animated, but I'm going to do it really quick so that I don't over explain it. Right, here's our stylized version. We had the Danelaw, don't forget, but this doesn't last. This doesn't create a lasting peace. And then there's this guy, Æthelræd, who's like, yeah, let's just massacre the Danes. BT Dubs, his first wife is Ælfred of York. And then his second wife is Emma of Normandy, right? So their kids are actually half Saxon, half Norman, which means all Germanic, just some of them speak French. Weird fact, Emma of Normandy decides to change her name to Ælfred once she marries the guy, which just gets super creepy. Anyway, Æthelræd the Unready, not a great king. He massacres actually a bunch of Danes living in Britain, and that gets, lots of rage, and then he's a coward, so he flees with his family to Normandy. Swine doesn't last, so he comes back, and then you just have a whole bunch of fighting over who is the actual successor. So King Knut comes in from Norway and Denmark, and he actually wins this war and marries Emma / Ælfred. Weirdly, Knut also has a first wife named Ælfred. Not sure if she's dead yet or if this is a polygamous arrangement. And so we have Emma Ælfred now taking the second place as the second wife of an Ælfred and adopting the name Ælfred. Weird. Anyway, they have kids. So her kids with her first marriage, they're staying with their cousin Will in Normandy so that Knut doesn't murder them. Oops. So they have kids. Knut ends up taking off and establishing the Great North Sea Empire, because that's his thing, I guess. But he eventually dies, and when he does, there is a succession problem. Now, what Knut does is what is typical of Germanic succession, and I want to point this out because this is also the problem in the Carolingian Empire, right? Charlemagne's empire. Germanic traditions of succession divide a kingdom among the heirs, right? And sometimes that includes women, because remember, women had rights. And so what will happen is kingdoms will slowly get piecemealed out, this piece and that piece and this piece. And as the generations go, the pieces get smaller and smaller. And eventually that the smallness of those pieces and the inability of those parcels of land to support the people living on them, that becomes unsustainable. And then somebody else fights a bunch of wars and conquers the region and then consolidates, and the process starts over. So that's how Germanic succession works, which is not a great long-term strategy if you don't want to be in a constant cycle of war. So he splits up his territories among his sons. They don't all live at the same amount of time. So eventually his oldest son with Emma ends up king in Britain, but not for long. Look at that, 2 years. And so she comes on back, but he dies. And then it's like, well, now who? So enter Edward the Confessor, who is her second son by her first husband. Remember that? And he has a legit claim to the throne, but his older brother decided to try and go back to England at a very inopportune time and didn't make it. So, actually, Edward, I think, is Emma's oldest son. I think Edmund Ironsides is Æthelred's son from his first marriage, which is not important to you, I know. So anyway, Edward and William are bros. They've been growing up together over here in Normandy, maybe more than that, because before Edward leaves, according to history, legend, whatever, he promises William that William will inherit his throne, which is an interesting thing because he's kind of a young dude and he's probably going to get married, and he's like, I'm definitely not going to be producing an heir. How does he know? Interesting. So here's a look at the history of Normandy. We're not going to get into this. The point is, Normans are Northmen. And so what ends up happening is when Edward and Emma return and Edward is crowned, he's married off to a local Saxon gal. She's actually half Saxon, and half Viking, and they don't produce any kids, right? So when he dies, we have this whole issue of who takes the throne now. The Godwins, that's his in-laws, they're like, oh, well, we have a claim to the throne. And at this point, heretical succession is pretty much the norm. Not heretical, hereditary, not heretics, inheritance. Anyhow, more coffee. So, Edith, that's his wife, Edith's brother, Harold, is like, well, Edward told me on his deathbed that he wants me to inherit the throne. And everybody's like, are you sure about that? William in particular, not so cool with this. And he's like, no, because Edward definitely told me that I'm in charge. So he brings an entire fleet, and in short order, he's like, yeah, okay, we're done here. So this is what 1066 represents in English history. It's called the Norman invasion, but William has a legitimate claim to the throne. Number one, not just because he was promised it by Edward, but because he's Edward's cousin. So he is his relation by blood, and Harold is only his relation by marriage. So legit claim. Also has a common ethnic background, but when he comes on in, and boy, does he knock that shit out fast. Excuse me. He arrived. Pardon me. He arrives in September, and he's crowned on Edward's chair in Westminster Abbey by Christmas Day. And he's like, yeah, no, we're done here, guys. Anyway, with William comes a few key changes to Britain. And this is what's been going on in the continent to deal with the fact that Germanic succession is so unstable, and it's feudalism. So feudalism is the division of society into three estates: those who fight, those who pray, and those who work, or the aristocracy, the knighthood, the church, and the peasantry. He also brings with him a different form of inheritance, which is primogeniture, and that is the inheritance of only the eldest born son. And that creates its own set of problems, which we're going to see a little bit later. But primogeniture essentially solves the problem of splitting up kingdoms and then creates the problem of what do you do with younger sons, and if you have daughters, right? Like, what do you have to marry them off, and can you afford to marry them all off with a good bride price or a good dowry, or do you have to ship some of your younger sons and daughters off to the church because you can't afford to maintain them, right? Because inheritance is so important, and we've talked about this with other cultures, women are property now, right? They just go kind of instantaneously excuse me, from being people to being property, because if you only allow your eldest born son to inherit your lands, it actually starts to become really important that the person who is inheriting them is in fact your son, and so you have to police women's bodies. He also does excuse me. He also does what is essentially England's first census, the Doomsday Book, so he knows how much he owns. And he brings with them the French language, which means that you have a lot of different languages being spoken in Britain, because you not only have all the old forms of Celtic and the Romano-British and the Saxon forms. Romano-British has really been replaced by Old English, but weird pockets of it will survive in certain areas. So you have that already. And then when you bring in French feudalism, he essentially displaces all Saxon aristocrats, vassals, and installs his own family and kin and allies in these areas. And so the aristocracy is all of a sudden French speaking, and the church is Latin, right? So that is why French is the language of law in England, even in some instances, even today, but for a really long time. So this stratifies the language and it changes English. This is why English is no longer a Germanic language. It is a weird hybrid between German, this German form that at its roots, and the French form that overlays on top of it, and a little Latin sprinkled in. So it's a weird language, and it's kind of interesting that we decide that the Germanic form is the origins of modern English, and we call it Old English instead of just Saxon, and that we don't locate early Middle English, is what we call this language where it's all hybridized. We don't call that Old English, right, as the first form of English. Again, that's a 19th century distinction that comes about because we want to locate our racial origins with the Saxons and the Angles in that mythical Anglo-Saxon. So once again, institutional history participating in global white supremacy. Okay. So High Middle Ages, Franglandy. I'm not going to get into the weeds here, but the key takeaway I want you to get from this is that the entire English monarchy now descends from William, even to this day. But as generations go, that gets more and more convoluted, and that leads to a bunch of conflict. And it also leads to the consolidation of a kingdom that spans the English Channel. But while this is happening, we have the Crusades. So the People's Crusade happens in 1096, and that they get slaughtered, absolutely slaughtered. They're not actually warriors, and they're just marching on Jerusalem. And the key thing to know about this is that the Pope only authorizes this first crusade because the church has recently split between East and West because they had an argument over the date of Easter. I shit you not, that is not an exaggeration. There were a couple of other doctrinal elements too, but that was the big one. And he is hoping that if he sends military aid to the Byzantine Empire, which is the last Christian empire in the region, to fend off the incoming Seljuk Turks, that maybe they could reunify the church. So that's his motivation here. So, crusade. They send this crusade, and it is the only one that is successful, in a real sense, because it is a freaking surprise attack, right? We already talked about Islam and their principle of non-aggression. So they fight only defensive wars. That doesn't really seem to be quite the case for the Seljuk Empire, right? But for the Fatimid Caliphate, which is down here in the bottom, and that is what had controlled this region, that is still the practice, at least on paper. So surprise attack from random people from way far away, not even neighbors. And they're like, this land belongs to us because Jesus. That's a thing. While that's happening, we have this succession in England. And then there's a second crusade, and it is a miserable failure. Because after the first crusade, the excuse me, the Fatimid Caliphate that they had just taken everything from was like, no, okay, and they took it back. And so then you need a second crusade, obviously, to retake it. And the only reason I mention this is because the only part of this that is remotely successful is the pan-Germanic group of crusaders on their way, boop, 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 over here. They don't actually make it. They stop here in Portugal. And in Portugal, the Portuguese are like, hey, we have Saracens, which is their completely inaccurate derogatory term for Muslims. We have Saracens right here. How about y'all just fight these guys and help us take Lisbon? So they do. That part is successful in that sense. And they don't make it to the Middle East. The rest of that is a miserable failure. Meanwhile, in England, we have Henry II, and oh boy, is he a piece of work. This is the guy who establishes the Angevin Empire. So this is everything that he controls. He's the Duke of Normandy, and the King of England, not exactly by inheritance. He sort of strong arms his cousin into the throne. And when his dad dies, his dad is the Count of Anjou and Maine. He acquires this territory, and then when he marries Eleanor of Aquitaine, there's a great classic movie called The Lion in Winter, in which Katharine Hepburn plays Eleanor of Aquitaine. Highly recommend for quarantine watching. Anyway, he acquires Aquitaine. So these are the things that he's kind of legally entitled to. The rest of that stuff he gets by conquest, including the county of Nantes. But that's a treaty. The rest of it's just kind of incursion. But Henry's sons are not up to the task. He has a lot of sons. I think I have actually. Yeah, there you go. He has a lot of sons. And the one who ends up inheriting is Richard, better known as Richard the Lionheart. But Richard goes on crusade. And while Richard is gone, John is in charge. And yeah, he is a crappy king. He's a super crappy leader. But anyway, so Richard is a part of the Third Crusade, which is the only other even moderately successful crusade. There are going to be 6 to 9 more, depending on how you count, and none of them will be successful at all. And it is successful insofar as they make it to Palestine, kinda, and they reconquer some territory through this region from Antioch to Tripoli to Acre. So Acre is the key one. That's where Richard is at. And Richard is not a good guy. But look at this. In England, after Richard does this is about a century after this crusade, you have this map of the Holy Land, and you'll notice this is Jerusalem, teeny tiny little, afterthought, because Jerusalem was not actually conquered. But Richard here with his 3 lion insignia, Acre, this is so important. We've got Acre. Oh, wait, let's back up real quick and just have a look at this map. I want to point out that one of the things that Richard is famous for is the reason he gets his name Lionheart is because of his fighting in the Crusades. And allow me to explain exactly how that worked. He went in and laid siege to a city in the Middle East before he gets all the way to Acre. And he conquers it, right? He wins. But there are a bunch of Muslim non-combatant inhabitants in this area. And Saladin, who is the Islamic military leader, is offending Richard's ego a bit and won't treat with him in person, which is like maybe smart because Richard probably would have just assassinated him. But because he won't treat with him in person, Richard runs out of patience. He lines up all of the Muslim inhabitants of the city on the wall in the sight of Saladin. And this includes women and children and non-combatants, right? And he beheads them, over 2,000 of them, on that wall in the sight of Saladin. And that is how he wins. That is how he wins his victories in the Middle East. And this is horrifyingly offensive to the Islamic folks, and it is enraging because it is a complete violation of what counts as just warfare. So, right, in this region, popular culture likes to think of the Crusades as a holy war, which is in fact what they called it. But it was definitely a war of unprovoked aggression built upon the premise that it is acceptable to surprise attack people who are not like yourselves. And I'll tell you why, because the Pope was like, hey, if they're not Christian, they don't count. So you can absolutely displace, enslave, and slaughter anybody who's not a Christian because they're subhuman. Yay, Pope, Crusades. That's where our language comes from for that. So then you have this whole problem where Richard, he's just like much more into fighting than he is into ruling. So he doesn't produce an heir in time. And then that means that the kingship goes to John, who was not any good at this. So John loses like all of France, all of it. So by the time that John is done, the only thing that's left is like a little bit of Aquitaine, and that's because he inherited it, and then he loses that too. So he turns to, pissing on the people who are closer to him. Yay! That's always fun. And because he's such a shit king, you have the Magna Carta. So the other lords are like, hey, dude, stop. Super annoying. And this is the establishment, essentially, of the English Parliament, as they will brag, as the oldest constitutional democracy in the world. This is a little fuzzy there. But they are correct in that they form the right to have a parliament and have a check on the power of the king, because John is miserable. John. Anyhow, it doesn't really get better, and shit just... the view for succession turns inward instead of outward. So succession goes fine, but that means that aggression is moving towards other people in the British Isles. In particular, they are trying to acquire Scotland still. So the Wars of Scottish Independence is kind of a misnomer because Scotland is independent. They're just trying to keep it that way. And there's a whole other thing. Robert the Bruce, that's Mel Gibson. But while that's going on, they also have the 100 Years' War with France because John just lost all that territory, and subsequent monarchs are like, no, let's get it back. Let's just keep fighting in France. And it's Joan of Arc. She's a part of this, but it's not successful. The one thing that does come out of that is Chevauchee, or an extra special invention of the English, which is slash and burn. No, that's agriculture. Scorched earth. I mean, they do slash and they do burn. But what they actually do is they raid. They take this like Viking tactic and they update it for armored cavalry. Right? They pillage, they burn the agriculture, and they terrorize civilians on purpose in order to allow a small group, a free company, to do a lot of damage in a region that they don't actually occupy. This is not unrelated to siege warfare, which is designed to starve people, but this is like a more direct attack on people's access to subsistence, right? If you burn the crops, nobody can eat. So chivalry, always a lie, always a romanticization to cover up the cultural values, but also old, right? Vikings did it. And then we have this problem because everybody's been fighting in France for so long that the aristocracy are dying off and the line of succession gets kind of blurry. And so you have the Scottish Years of Independence, you have the 100 Years' War, and now you don't actually know who is the next in line to succession if somebody doesn't produce a direct eldest male heir for primogeniture. So what you have is the House of Lancaster has split off from the House of York. And this is where we get to the High Middle Ages. The Late Middle Ages. So we're going to pause this video here, and then we'll talk about the Late Middle Ages.